Barry Rabe is the J. Ira and Nicki Harris Family Professor at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan, where he also directs the Center for Local, State, and Urban Policy. He's currently a Public Policy Fellow with the Wilson Center's Canada Institute. Barry, welcome to Now. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, John.
Among your many credits, I should also say you co-direct the National Survey on Energy and Environment, a twice-annual survey of American public views on climate change and related issues, a new report coming out as we speak. But before I ask you about that, I want to set the broader context by asking to get your first reaction to the Paris climate deal. Is this more or less exceeding expectations, about what you expected? Where does it fall?
This is a big deal. It perhaps somewhat exceeds expectations, and yet it is not a done deal, because the day after, the months after, will really determine whether or not this is a significant transition point or not. It's no secret that the predecessors to Paris, the Kyoto Protocol and other international meetings, have struggled mightily with this kind of a policy problem, where clearly there is a need for all the nations of the world to collaborate and cooperate, but getting them on the same page and then imposing or establishing those policies that are needed been hugely, hugely challenging. Some successes, some non-successes. Paris begins to bind together a wide number of pledges or promises that hundreds, literally, of nations have made going into this meeting about what they're going to do with their energy and climate emissions over a decade or more, with a mechanism to review that every 5 years or so. But again, what happens when those ministers of state return to their national capitals, including the Washington, D.C. context, and proceed on these issues, Canada much the same issue, is really hard to know at this point, and knowing whether there's going to be momentum beyond Paris on this issue.
We've already heard rumblings from politicians who are opposed to the agreement, there's going to be that. And you mentioned pledges and promises. We're not talking about enforceable standards. This is compliance by volunteer basis, essentially.
This does not create an international police force to monitor with sanctions, to be sure. We see pledges for where emissions are going to be over time. We see pledges over how much money nations like Canada and the U.S. will be putting into the pot and sharing with developing economies so they can participate in some of these technological and energy transitions as well. There's a monitoring system in place to actually measure what is or is not being done, or is not being accomplished. But the sanctions for that really don't exist. It's a little more than an honor system, if you will, but it's still largely assuming that every nation will honor whatever it is that they said that they were going to do in coming to this agreement.
And if they do, let's be optimistic. If they do, are we into the game changer that some have been waiting for, in terms of a real move away from a fossil fuel economy and something that could gain momentum and be transformational?
There really could be a transformation already underway. Intriguing, just in the last few weeks during the Paris meetings, we began to get data that suggested that the rate of greenhouse gas emissions has been growing globally in the last couple of years less than we anticipated, a kind of stabilization. That's partly due to countries like the United States, Canada, the European Union, but also China and India beginning to bend that curve back a little for a number of factors. So there's some thinking that this is beginning to emerge. We've seen progress on this front in the U.S. with a drop of roughly 10% over the last 10 years in our greenhouse gas emissions without a binding national commitment. So there's some reason, even before the Paris Agreement, that change could be underfoot and that perhaps Paris could accelerate. Again, though, all of this is contingent on goodwill, follow-through amongst the nations of the world, and on climate, like a wide range of other issues, that's not a slam dunk by any means.
Well, one thing about tipping points is often they're impossible to identify in real time. It's only with hindsight that you can realize that something just happened. Let me ask you about your survey, your latest release of data. And if you could tie it to this discussion of the climate deal and any momentum that is building. What are the latest findings? What do they indicate? And do they speak to some sort of growing momentum?
There may be some signs here that that's the case. And this is a national telephone survey of a national audience, landline users and cell phone users in the United States, That's a partnership between the University of Michigan and Muhlenberg College. We began this work in the fall of 2008, which is interesting to think about because some argue that was a high watermark of concern, at least in the United States, on climate issues. It was the time President Obama was elected for the first term, and expectations that the U.S. was really going to move on this. So we've seen now in the surveys we've done for this fall, and comparing them to earlier ones, that there has been a rise up in American concern on this issue, belief that warming global temperatures are real, that they see evidence of this, of a jump back up to the 70% level on that question for the first time really since 2008. And with it, support for a fairly broad range of policy initiatives. In the study that you're talking about also that we're about to release information on how Americans feel about the latest component of American climate policy, President Obama's Clean Power Plan, which has gained a lot of attention in Washington and nationally. And there we asked a sample of Americans across the country how they would like their state to respond to this new mandate placed by the federal government on each state that reduces their emissions from the electric power sector, a big part of this issue, over the next 15 years or so. There we found a fairly broad base of support for the idea that people want their states to enter into negotiation with the federal government to develop a plan, and actually support for a wide range, but not all of the possible ways that they might get to that path.
Majority support, 53%, if I remember
Yes.
correctly. So when you look around the globe or at other countries where you have some similar data to your studies, where does the United States sit? Are we ahead of the curve, behind the curve? Where are we?
The U.S. in some ways has been behind the curve, at least in terms of this threshold of, do you believe global warming is occurring? Do you believe that this is significant or human causation? There, if you compare the U.S., certainly with Canada, but the European Union and other countries, there's been a pretty substantial gap, especially in the last few years, between the U.S. and almost all of these other countries.
Well, I think I've heard read that we're the only industrialized democracy with a major political party that denies global warming.
That's right. This was really an interesting feature of the Paris Accords, where in previous international meetings, an opposition party or even a party in government in another country would show up on the scene and say, we don't think climate change is occurring, much less that action should be taken. The U.S. really does remain the outlier here amongst almost all the major nations in the world in having a major political party and substantial political force that not only is raising questions about the Paris agreements and what they might mean for their own country, but is actually raising questions about whether there's even evidence that global warming has been occurring.
Does any of your research give you a hint as to why that might be, why the U.S. remains the outlier?
We do indeed see, however we ask these questions, John, very strong cleavage in terms of political partisanship, Republican versus Democrat. And yet, in some respects, on this last survey that we took, again, in the fall survey of this year, the cleavage seemed to be declining somewhat, and in some respects, less differences. We actually attribute that to a number of factors. One is that people clearly respond to and cue off of relatively recent experience with weather, and whether it's weather experiences in their own neighborhood or being greater aware of drought in the U.S., or even reacting to Pope Francis and his message, with which Americans across the political spectrum in our survey really do resonate to some extent on this particular issue. That seems to be changing somewhat, and yet at the end of the day, when you ask Republicans and Democrats on this question in a great many ways, you get still significantly different answers, and hence that may explain some of the partisan cleavage we see.
So it sounds like what you're describing is more a case of identity politics rather than a scientific inquiry.
There's clearly not a lot of evidence that any Americans have time to dive deeply into the vast scientific literature on this. And so where do we look for information and cues? Clearly there are a range of media and informational outlets, but we also realize that people often turn to, gee, what happened in my own backyard? Mm-hmm. How was the weather? How was the winter? Snow effect, these kinds of things. Or how that might be interpreted by local meteorologists and the like. This is a very complex, multifaceted process, and yet across the spectrum of public policy and science and technology issues, any citizen only has so much time to devote to it unless they happen to be particular specialists. And so we all take our cues, and we think that this is going on in this case, with the interesting issue of whether or not this transition that we're beginning to see globally on this issue is also really beginning to kick in the United States. In Canada, by the way, we've just not seen this big jump and shift in public opinion over recent years that we have in the U.S. In fact, we had a Wilson Center event
Has stayed more stable in Canada?
Much more stable and at a much higher level of belief that this is real and a real concern.
Two final questions, Barry. One, a bit of business, and then I'll ask the other. The first, the business. Where the people who want to see the most recent survey on power plants, and then those who want to see your ongoing research, where can they find this?
Sure. The publication home for most of our reports is CLOSUP, the Center for Local, State, and Urban Policy. That's a research center at the Gerald Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. We try to post everything quickly and are in a program to put our all of our data available and make it available in a user-friendly way for folks to take a look at.
So CLOSUP, one word minus the E.
Yes, sir.
And then my final question is what will you be looking for as far as we move away from the Paris talks and the agreement to see that it is or isn't working? What are the indicators that you'll be looking for?
Well, along with this sort of emerging consensus of recognition that climate change is a serious issue, has been a very broad consensus in the policy science community, economists, other scholars, that if we are to deal with this issue, we have to impose a price on carbon to drive that price up and deter consumption, for which there are previous parallels.
Are you talking about cap and trade?
Could be cap and trade, could be a carbon
tax. Just one way to do it.
Just one way to do it. Okay. Plenty of previous parallels for this. We think of tobacco and how we drove down consumption. That's a tough political act because you're basically engaging in a rise, at least short term, of a commodity that's very familiar. We all know the price.
All the costs are up front and all the benefits are long term.
Exactly. That's a tough political decision.
Tough sell.
It's a tough sell short term for long term benefit. Will we see states, provinces in Canada, nations of the world adopt this policy? In other words, if they've made certain pledges, for numeric pledges about where they're going to be in these numbers by 2022, 2028 and beyond, how are they going to get there? How transparent are they going to be? How effective will they be? And are any policies that they might put into place now or have already begun to create, will those be durable? Will those stand the test of time? So far, we're learning that governments are all over the place in the ability to make that initial commitment and deliver on it, because this is a very volatile area, a lot of strong political reaction. So to me, that really becomes the acid test. It's one thing to put your name on a piece of paper and pledge. It's another thing to really deliver over an extended period of time.
Well, we'll be watching. We know you'll be watching.
Look forward to it.
Thanks, Barry. Always a pleasure.
John, thank you.